Okay, folks, here's the deal. While I'm capable of making a new episode of Fighting Gems based on the Bloody Roar series, I don't want to because I feel that there are entries in that series which are unpolished, unrefined, and generally of poor quality. And this is coming from the guy who thought that Rabbit was a prime contender for the Fighting Gems series, so well, actually, now that I say that out loud, that says a lot more about me than it does about the Bloody Roar games. But that's besides the point. I just don't feel like my heart's into it. And yet, I don't feel like I should exclude any particular game because the series as a whole is so unique. I can only think of a few fighting games that come close to doing what the Bloody Roar series set out to do, and while there are a few games in other genres which accomplish something similar, none of them could ever really substitute what makes the Bloody Roar series so special. So, I've come to a compromise. I will soon ramble and rant about the series, and whatever I can salvage from my little rambling session, I will put to video and then upload to YouTube. So, with that said, let's begin. Wait, no, one last thing. While I didn't mean for this to be a Halloween special or anything like that, I think the timing is quite nice. Well, with that said, let's begin. The first Bloody Roar game was released in arcades in about 1997 or so, I believe. I think it was the first game from Rising that wasn't in the shooter genre, because at that point, Rising was known for their shoot 'em ups like Kingdom Grand Prix and Terra Driver. Rising at the time had become a subsidiary of 18, although they originally came from the same company. And really, it's easy to see why it's so rough around the edges since it was their first game outside of the shooter genre that they had made. Since they sort of cribbed little things here and there from games like Virtua Fighter, Dead or Alive, Soul Edge, Battle Arena Toshinden, etc., etc. It was the late 90s, pretty much everyone did it. But the main hook of the game was that fighters would be able to transform at any point in the match and actually gain more power and strength and act more in a more feral manner. And they really got off on the right foot with that. So the premise of the game is simple. In another world, there's a planet populated by beings called zoanthropes. They have the ability to change from human to a half-human, half-beast hybrid, a anthropomorphized being. Most of them are peaceful, but some of them are driven by the will to fight. And of course, with a setup like that, you know some token evil corporation is going to swoop in and cause havoc and mayhem. Enter the Tyrant Foundation. Tyrant, etc. They commit all sorts of atrocities like biological testing and so on and so forth, and some people want to aid them and some people want to help them, and some people want to destroy them, and well, there you go. Super basic storytelling conflict. I will say this though. They really nailed the idea of becoming a beast. A monster in that sense. In beast form, their moves change. Their techniques become different. They become more feral, more powerful, and the effects are more exaggerated. There's a real payoff for transforming as opposed to just having a slightly different model. That's taken to another extent when Rave Mode is activated. The first game had a mode called Rave Mode that could be activated once you had already transformed into a beast. And once this was done, your animations actually sped up quite a bit. So much so that stuff like chains that had gaps in them would lose those gaps and become solid attack chains. And is it just me, or did a lot of Japanese devs back then have a fascination with the word rave? I mean, you had aerial raves in the Versus series. Tekken would just slap rave into any of their advertising. I'm sure I could find more examples, but that just comes off the top of my head. So, Bloody Roar did well for itself. The PSX port was a sterling success. I think that came out in '98, and that was published by Hudson Soft. Hudson would go on to publish most of the Bloody Roar games from that point on. It did really well on the PSX because it was one of those early PSX games that was a port of the arcade, and people were marveling at the fact that it looks almost exactly like the arcade version. That was actually a pretty big technical achievement back then. So riding this wave of success, 18 and Rising made
Bloody Roar 2, the new breed.
bigger, it's badder, it's better, it's got more characters, although 4 of the original cast got cut, which was a bummer for people who liked them. Bakuryu the Mole, Gregory the Gorilla, Mitsuko the Boar, and Hans the Fox. Bakuryu eventually came back, but Hans, Gregory, and Mitsuko never did. They never even got people who were like them. There were no more boars, gorillas, or foxes in the rest of the series, although their moves were sort of divvied up and given to other characters who would be introduced either in this game or the ones following. So, as with most big sequels, especially sequels with the letter 2 in the title, there was a big shakeup. Well, not a big shakeup. Actually, it's the next game. Bloody Roar 2 had more of an iterative impact on the series. Things were refined, such as guarding. There was a new option to block guard crushing moves instead of just having to move past them or move away from them. There were new stun states added, so that you could actually force people to crouch or to fall back with more hit stun, or even counter hit them to get more hit stun. And that led to more setups and more or less a more refined game. And they also sort of compartmentalized Rave mode into the Beast Gauge itself. They made a new version of the Beast Gauge that could go into the Hyper Beast Gauge, and players could go into Hyper Beast form. It was essentially the same as Rave, but they just made it a bit less complicated, a bit more streamlined by managing it all in one gauge. And they also added something big and flashy, something called the Beast Drive. It was essentially a super, and it used up your entire Beast Gauge, but it did a ton of damage. It had guard breaking properties, so that you had to either heavy guard it, sidestep it, or get hit by it. And once you used it, it made you return to human form. So it was sort of an all or nothing attack. And you know how that's always a crowd pleaser. So the premise for this game was slightly more interesting. After the fall of the corporation, all their plans were sort of laid to waste. Normally when an evil corporation in the fighting game is destroyed, it's all hunky-dory until another one replaces it immediately. But apparently the Tyrant Foundation was the Byzantine Empire of this world. When they went down, everything just sort of became destabilized. And there's some sort of liberation battlefront trying to free people, except, well, you know how liberators tend to operate. They usually cause more havoc than they prevent. So, decent premise, iterative design, pretty much an improvement in almost every way. Bloody Roar 2 was a proper sequel in every sense of the term. Unfortunately, there were a lot of things that were lost on the general public. For example, for whatever reason, there was a programming snafu where people couldn't sidestep anymore when they were using the analog button, the analog stick, instead of the D-pad. So a lot of people thought that they actually took sidestepping out of Bloody Roar 2, including a bunch of journalists who pretty much lambasted the game for it. Not to say that they should have been kinder to it, or that they should have withheld their criticism, but you know, this is an example of people being given a chance to go hog wild when criticizing something and not even showing a bit of restraint or any sort of semblance of experimentation. But that's in the past, and it didn't really hurt the game series that much. So, a little time after, at around 2000, Hudson went and released Bloody Roar 3 in arcades. Now this was a game that really shook things up. Added a whole bunch of characters, finally gave people the chance to sidestep manually. outside of the last game's custom mode where you could sidestep manually there, but you still had to do this sort of guard parrying thing in order to sidestep in the regular game form, which must have been frustrating. And they added a whole new slew of guarding mechanics and heck, even a new attack plane called semi-mid, where high attacks hit mid and low attacks hit in all sorts of other planes. It was weird. It was like everybody was Leon from Virtual Fighter. Counterattacks, more cancelable parts from chains, the ability to dodge attacks that were incoming. They pretty much gave the game a stronger defensive aspect, while maintaining a slightly different but still high-paced offensive aspect. They bolstered defense, is what I'm trying to say in my usual verbose way. Gosh, it's been so long I can't actually remember much about the story. All I remember is that something called, what was it? The Shima Corporation? Or was it Tyrant again? Some sort of corporation was back at it, taking over where Tyrant had left off and doing an even worse job of it somehow. But since so much time had passed between the first two games and the third one, people had grown stronger, developed new techniques, so on and so forth. And apparently everyone decided that one beast drive wasn't enough, so everyone developed a second beast drive technique. And more often than not, the secondary technique would have some sort of slightly different effect. It wasn't just pure damage. I know that some of them would shift into human form during their beast drives early, and reserve a little bit of beast of meter in the beast gauge for later. It was sort of a preemptive transformation coupled within a devastating super weapon. In fact, if I remember correctly, some characters even had enhanced beast drives, which would do more damage, but which had much stricter requirements. So, it did fairly well, Bloody Roar 3 that is. Sold a lot of copies, got a lot of play in arcades. So much so that Hudson and Aiting decided that it would be a great time to port it to the GameCube. They called the port Bloody Roar Primal Fury, and they actually made a whole slew of improvements. They switched around the models, they refined the model a bit, they added better particle effects, they added new stages, including some with collapsible parts that would actually lead to other sections of the stages. So for once, busting down a wall actually means something other than a ring out. They added even more characters, including a character called Fang from a tie-in comic, although they removed Fang for the American GameCube release. And overall, they made a bunch of balance changes, which to most people made the game palatable. There are still some things that people didn't like, for example, some of the new models, or some of the beast mode transformations, or just the idea that there are more complicated defensive options than block harder, and block 2 the reckoning. But for the most part, the port was well received, and since Nintendo fans in particular were being starved for fighting game options outside of Smash Bros. Melee, they really appreciated it. Or as much as you can appreciate somebody creating a product for you to consume. Fukuya in particular was really jazzed about it. I remember he had an interview with IGN where they were discussing the differences between Primal Fury and Bloody Roar 3. He was ecstatic. He was so glib about the new models and the new stages and the new characters and the new balance changes. And he even played around with the idea that maybe the GameCube could get a sequel to Primal Fury 2, as it were. And he just said that GameCube is such a step up from the PS2 that it helped him realize the vision for the series more effectively, or some such thing like that. He loved it so much that he decided to make a port for the Xbox in 2003 to share the love, I guess. That's not really fair, considering that it's just a port of Primal Fury, but still, it seemed odd for him to go on and on about how great it was to work on the GameCube, and then BAM! Xbox port. What are you gonna do? That was actually the thing back then, although some people might not really remember it. It wasn't so much that they made revisions, it was that, hey, we've got something we can fix. Let's fix it on the strongest console. People get so upset that revisions are made at all now. Sometimes I wonder if they forgot that it used to be much, much worse. If I remember correctly, the main difference between Extreme and Primal Fury is that in Extreme, more balance changes were made. The animated cutscenes were switched out for CGI cutscenes, and Fang was retained for the US release, which of course led people to believe that the Xbox version had a new character, and that made a lot of people upset. Not to mention that people who had already gotten Bloody Roar 3 were possibly the most livid of all, since it was ported not once but twice to alternate systems without any chance for PS2 owners to get the new gameplay. To get the new versions of the games. So all these revisions kind of fragmented the fan base, and the series slowly crept out of the memory of the public. And then Bloody Roar 4 happened. Don't get me wrong, I don't really believe in the idea that a series can die. I mean, series are pulled out of the old war chest as soon as there's money to be made. So if a series can die, it can also be revived as easy as one can snap their fingers. But if anything were a series killer, Bloody Roar 4 would be that sort of thing. I mean, it does pretty much most of the things that you're not supposed to do if you want to make your fans happy. New horrible UI? Check. Gameplay changes that that more or less make everything worse? Check. A new protagonist? Check. Pushing the old protagonist to the side in a subplot? Check. New convoluted single-player modes that do nothing but frustrate? Check. Hiding the other, more popular characters in a paywall while introducing new boring characters? Check. Actually, that's all the checks I can think of, but that's far too many as it is. To be perfectly honest, I can't even really tell you the plot of 4 outside of the idea that they decided they really needed an explanation for why Xeon is called the Unborn, so they made some sort of
Thank you very much. Thanks to you, the dragon has been resealed.
What's the connection with the Unborn?
The dragon was made by the life force of this planet itself. Its purpose was to rid this planet of useless life and life that damaged the planet.
The Unborn was held back by the dragon a long time ago, right?
Yes, that's right.
Thinking about it isn't as painful as actually watching the cutscenes, though. This was supposed to be Hudson and Eiting's big chance to make a thorough, detailed story mode for Bloody Roar, and they failed miserably. Cutscenes are horribly acted and horribly directed. The English and Japanese VA are both equally terrible. I don't even know how that happened, since they had the same VAs for the most part for Bloody Roar 4 as they did for Bloody Roar 3, but, well, there you go. Career mode, which is really just a mission mode, is just a series of lopsided fights with varying rounds and health values, and some lousy version of currency called DNA that they use to hide the older, more popular characters behind a paywall. And it's just not a very good game to boot. I mean, the game's greatest strength is that it reuses assets from Bloody Roar 3 very well, and that anything that is intact from Bloody Roar 3 works the way it's supposed to. Which is a horrible thing to say for a game. I mean, you're in bad luck if the best thing you can say about a game is that it uses everything from the older games well. But that's just how it is with this installment. Anything else is pretty much dreadful. They made changes to how guarding works, so much so that only certain characters can guard manually while others have to deal with the dodge move that was introduced in Bloody Roar 3, but worse. It's as if somebody thought, you know what? Let's differentiate the quick characters from the slow characters by having the quick characters be nimble, lightning fast strikers who can dodge things effortlessly, and the strong characters be iron walls. And nobody had the good sense to tell the person who suggested this to go in the corner and sit about what they've done. So now we're stuck with characters who need to be able to block who can't, and characters who should be able to dodge who definitely can't. And really, the worst thing about it is what they did to the whole concept of transformation itself. They tied the health and beast gauge together. And for whatever reason, fighters have about... well, no, I know why. Fighters have about a third as much health as they used to. And this is all done to help bolster the idea of the two gauges being combined. Basically, the beast gauge acts as a sort of buffer, a sort of armor for the human health bar. It's sort of like regenerating armor in all of those in all of those FPSs that come out later. That used to come out between 06 and 09. You know what I mean. It's an interesting idea on paper, but in execution, it's pretty much terrible. You get a full gauge of beast meter when you start the match, and if you can manage to go through the entire match without being hit once, that's golden, but only one person's going to be able to do that. And because of the way that the gauge is set up, being in human form is not only a disadvantage, it's a liability. There is nothing to be gained from that outside of gaining more meter. And to the developer's credit, you can sacrifice your health in order to gain beast meter again, but then you're giving up the most important bar in order to power up the second most important bar, when previously that would have been handled by just keeping yourself safe. And you can't regenerate health anymore, so once you lose your red life, your human health, it's gone for the rest of the match. There's no way to recuperate or to gain a step. You just have to constantly go between trying to get meter and trying to mount an offense. It's as if, because they managed to make defense a solid option in Bloody Roar 3, they decided to make offense the dominant option in Bloody Roar 4, but they did it in the most back-asswards way possible. So, human form is a liability, Hyper Beast mode is practically suicidal, and beast drives are ill-advised outside of if you should ever manage to knock the other person down to their beast mode. The cool thing about it is that you kind of keep going while you're in beast form, even if you're completely out of health. Almost like you're running on adrenaline, but really that just makes things even more complicated. You'll transform whether you want to or not once you're out of health and you've got a little bit of beast form. So, for example, if you manage to catch someone while they're vulnerable in human form and you attack them, they gain so much meter by being hit that they build up a sizable amount of beast gauge, and they'll automatically transform when they die. It's like all the bad aspects of a burst system brought to life. They could be on the verge of defeat, and as soon as they're knocked out in one form, they transform into another. And any sort of additional attack that could put you in a vulnerable state when they transform will only lead to you becoming the victim instead of you attacking the other person. It's just bad. It's just bad. It is just bad. It's terrible. If there's one thing that stands out to me about Bloody Roar 4, it's that it's lukewarm. There's a decided lack of effort in this game. And it really shows because there are ways that they could have gotten around the limitations of it. They could have put more time and effort into the story mode.
What's in here, old man? I've got something I want to ask you, old man. What's the connection with the unborn?
You know about the unborn?
Mana, it has nothing to do with you. Stay out of this.
They could have come up with a more inventive way to incorporate missions. They could have certainly dealt with the gameplay changes themselves. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world that they combined health and the beast meter into one gauge. They could have certainly made a game that works towards that sort of gameplay, even if it wouldn't have been in line with the earlier games. But the problem is they introduced one or two aspects that would have helped that, and then they stopped. They did not do a thorough reworking of the gameplay mechanics in the Bloody Roar series up to that point. They just sort of introduced that, made a few changes that would help make the game less defensive, and then left it at that. So you've got these gameplay mechanics which don't really mesh well together, and in some cases actually obstruct one another or undercut one another, and it just makes the whole game a mess. While there are some interesting ideas, there's nothing really redeeming about Bloody Roar 4, outside of maybe the nice camera effects and animations that have been implemented whenever somebody gets knocked through a barrier. That's the nicest thing I'm going to say about this game. Knocking someone through a barrier is fun. And that's pretty much the only fun I've ever had with this game altogether. It's just a disappointment in every way, shape, and form possible. This was probably the nail in the Bloody Roar series' coffin. It was terrible. It was rightfully lambasted, and I can see why they didn't bother to make a new Bloody Roar game between now and recently, when Hudson Soft was shuttered, sold out to Konami. But if nothing else, the Bloody Roar series continues to live on in the fact that 18 always reuses their animations for their fighting games. And I imagine that 18 actually cut their teeth while making on the Bloody Roar series while deciding how to go about making fighting games and doing grunt work for other developers in general. So if nothing else, we have the Bloody Roar series to thank for all the fighting games that 18 has made since then. But since 18 is more or less self-sufficient and Hudson Soft is gone, we're probably not going to get, well, not gone, but Konami is pretty much the Metal Gear company at this point. They're not going to invest money into any other IP until they get over this period, if they ever do. So if Bloody Roar is effectively done, which is why it must have been so stymieing for hardcore fans of the series when someone pretended that they were associated with Hudson and kept hinting that they were making a new Bloody Roar. But at the same time, the reaction to that probably means that there's a lot of people who would love to see a new game in that series come out. So, I suppose time will tell.